Hi, I'm Dave Luong, and you're listening to Trek Rant, the Star Trek podcast where I rant, rave, overanalyze, and obsess about all things Trek. This is a quick mini podcast which I'll be doing, which you can find on the United Geek Federation's YouTube page or at our official website, www.unitedgeekfederation.wordpress.com. First off, I just want to quickly apologize. I think it's been about a month since my last Trek Rant podcast. Unfortunately, the real world's kind of been occupying a lot of my time lately. Work and all the usual, nonsense and what have you. But hopefully I can get back in the swing of things of not only doing more Trek Rant podcasts, but also our sister podcast, Kid Clown Kicker, with Gerardo, Phil, and Isa, which you can also find on our YouTube page and at our official website, www.unitedgeekfederation.wordpress.com. At any rate, for this episode of Trek Rant, in honor of this year being the 50th anniversary of Star Trek as a franchise, I wanted to do my best to distill why I love Star Trek. Why have I dedicated a lot of my personal time watching the television show, reading the comic books, reading the books, being a collector in general? Why Star Trek? Why do I consider this franchise so near and dear to my heart? And I did my best to try to distill the reasoning behind it into as condensed a list as I could. Again, a lot of you guys out there listening probably have different reasons why you love Star Trek, and I'd love to hear them, so feel free to post underneath this YouTube page or at our official website why you love Star Trek. So these are just the reasons that, for me personally, why I love it so much. First off, Star Trek just represents this great optimistic view of the future. It's often been said that Star Trek ultimately is a very optimistic show. You see that Earth is at peace, just generally speaking. Everyone gets along. There's a lot of tolerance between different groups on Earth as well as different species throughout the galaxy. And it's just, in general, there's always a light at the end of the tunnel, even in the more dark Star Trek episodes or even in the darker, I shouldn't say episodes, but storylines in general. I'll use DS9 as the example. Even though the Dominion War in general was a pretty dark storyline in terms of what Star Trek usually produces, there was still that hint of optimism, still that ultimate hint of hope. And that just permeates throughout the entire Star Trek franchise from the original series onward. There's always a lot of optimism, and I think that's something I really, really enjoy about Star Trek. The idea that there's always something to give you hope. There's always something to keep fighting for, always a reason to keep fighting. So that's my first reason why I like Star Trek so much, the optimistic view of the future. The second reason I love Star Trek so much, and I probably just touched a bit on it with my first point, but another reason I like it so much is Star Trek is a lot about overcoming obstacles, both external and internal obstacles. You'll often see the characters encountering some new problem on the show, whether it's something involving an outside alien species or just some personal issue that they're going through. And the show is ultimately as much about exploring the outside world as it is the inside, about the human soul. And ultimately the show is about someone's ability or the character's abilities in general to overcome these obstacles, overcome these issues. And again, that's another reason I love it so much. Ultimately, it's a lot of them focusing on the thing that's troubling them, that's an issue to them, and being able to overcome that through sheer will, through friendships, through intellect, just basically being able to problem solve and find their way outside of these tough situations. The third reason I love Star Trek so much is that ultimately it's a very inclusive television show. It's a show that transcends race, gender, sexual orientation, nationality, etc., all these other things that we tend to categorize ourselves under, these artificial categorizations. And that's just one of the reasons I do love Star Trek, especially when you watch, and I might be accidentally generalizing myself right now, but when you watch a lot of other television shows that are a little more I'm not sure the term I'm looking for, but not quite as diverse as Star Trek. To have Star Trek in your life, to be able to watch a show where it is all about infinite diversity, infinite combinations, about seeing people of different races, not only human within the term the human race, but also in terms of alien races and people of all different sorts of differences, any way you can define it, just getting along and being able to look past their differences, or maybe not look past, but maybe the word I'm looking for is to be able to appreciate other people's differences, and on top of that, to find common ground with which to work with. That message of inclusion in Star Trek is just, again, one of the reasons I love it so much. Next reason I love Star Trek is it does have some of the coolest aliens. I think I mentioned in some previous shows that I love the Klingons. I think they're just one of the greatest fictional alien species ever created. I love the Vulcans, love the Romulans. I did a whole episode about this, so you can go back and watch that episode. But the gist of it is that they do have these great alien species that, ironically, they're very human. They represent something about humanity, and there's a lot of great stories you can tell because of that with these different alien species. I also love the very cool spaceships you get in Star Trek. Especially with regards to the Federation vessels, there really was a lot of effort, you can tell, to make these ships all logical. Like, there's a reason why the nacelles stick out a certain way. It was something when they first designed it, they decided that would be the logic of the Star Trek world to help create a warp bubble, or why the deflector dish is located in a certain area, or why the ship is compartmentalized the way it is, with its primary hull and then a secondary hull and the two nacelles sticking out. There was a lot of effort to create a look to the vessels that made sense with regards to the mythos of Star Trek, and I really appreciated that. And just generally, I think they're cool. I think beyond any shadow of a doubt, the Enterprise, really the original Enterprise, is just the greatest science fiction vessel of all time, period. Another reason I love Star Trek so much is just great music in general. I think all the theme songs have been pretty superb. And yes, I do like Faith of the Heart. I know I'm going to get a lot of slack from some of you guys, but yeah, I do like that song. And I will also say that I just listened to Rihanna's Sledgehammer from the new Star Trek Beyond trailer, and it will also be part of the new Beyond soundtrack. And I really actually quite enjoyed that song as well. So again, Star Trek has always had a lot of great music attached to it. Next on my list of why I like Star Trek so much is that it's flexible in terms of its storytelling potential. With Star Trek, you can tell action stories. You can tell romance stories. You can tell hard science fiction stories. You can have morality plays. You can have comedic episodes, as we've seen. Star Trek, just because of the way it's structured, because of the mythos, because of just everything about it, you can tell so many different kind of stories, and they all make sense within the world of Star Trek, and they're all Star Trek stories, and I just love that. So that when you're watching episode Star Trek, you might get something completely different from the previous episode you just watched, or the episode you'll watch afterwards, and I just love that about Star Trek. My eighth reason why I love Star Trek so much is that it has a great fan base. Everyone who I've met who has said that they're a Trekkie, or who identifies as being a Trekkie, have all been terrific people. I think there's something that, if you're a fan of Star Trek, that you've learned that lesson of inclusion, and you tend to have a very good sense of humor about the franchise and about who you are and about things in general. So when I bump into other people and they tell me that they're a Trekkie, it's almost, and I hope I'm not actually accidentally generalizing here, but it's almost shorthand where you know that the person you're about to speak with is pretty cool, that you have this common connection, and that you'll have a good sense of humor about the thing that you share, about this love of Star Trek. Reason number 9 why I love Star Trek so much is that it has some of the best heroes in fiction, just across the board. You have characters who you can both relate to and aspire towards. I'll use Spock as a great example of that. I think that there's a lot in Spock that people can relate to in terms of being an outsider, in terms of feeling like you don't fit in. While at the same time, while you can relate to the character, you also aspire to be him, because he's a character who ultimately he wants to do the right thing. He's very logical. He's very much a problem solver and ultimately about doing what's right and ultimately helping out his crewmates. You can say the same thing about Captain Kirk. Ultimately, he's, for all his swagger, he's still a very fallible human being. So that's something you can relate to. While at the same time, you aspire to be him because he is always the guy who's going to find a way out. He's always going to be the person who doesn't believe in losing, who's going to fight his way through any problem. As I've said about Star Trek before, they're outcasts within a group. They're individuals within a team. They're just people who you can find a little bit of yourself or your friends in each of the characters and relate to them that way, but ultimately still they're role models. They're people who you want to base your life around, to be a little bit more like. And I just love that. I love that in a hero. So yeah, again, Star Trek has some of the best heroes in fiction. And my 10th, and for the purposes of this particular list, final reason I love Star Trek so much, it's ultimately a very human story. When you look at Star Trek and you peel away the layers of spaceships and science fiction stories and space travel and all the other trappings of the genre, it's ultimately a story about friendship, and it's a story about camaraderie. It's basically a show about going out, exploring the unknown with a group of people. They're not doing it alone. They're not going it alone. They're traveling in a group. They form friendships. They form sometimes adversarial friendships in a weird way. McCoy and Spock being a very good example. But they're ultimately still friends, and they ultimately want to discover things and learn about things as a group while still maintaining their individuality, which to me is a very human story. Which ultimately, and I'm going to steal a quote from somebody else, and I'm fogging up on who said it. So if someone listening can correct me and tell me who said it, please let me know in the comments. But someone once said Star Trek ultimately, while it's about exploring space, it's more about exploring the human spirit. And that's always what I got out of Star Trek. But those are 10 reasons why I love Star Trek so much. And Star Trek ultimately it's almost like a Rorschach test when you really think about it. You see what you want to see, and you get from it whatever you want to. Some people might like it more because it is a hard science fiction show. Other people might like it more because of the character interactions. Other people might like it because it's more of a comedy show to them. And none of everything in between, and all mix of those things and what have you. And none of that's wrong. You can love Star Trek for whatever reason you want to, and everyone has their own view of what makes Star Trek so great. And I think that's ultimately speaks to the power of the franchise and the flexibility of Star Trek in general. In any case, what do you think? What are some of the reasons you love Star Trek so much? Leave a comment on this YouTube page or visit us at our official website at www.unitedgeekfederation.wordpress.com and let me know what you think. Also, please subscribe so you can receive updates on future podcasts, not just this one, but our other shows on the United Geek Federation channel. I'm David Luong. Thanks for listening to Trek Rant.